Us, I'm Keesa. The recent drive for transparency of company ESG data and the disclosures of information is beginning to help identify gaps in areas that need attention. In this episode, we're going to discuss issues surrounding the pay gap, looking into why these discrepancies are happening, the data, as well as how to move forward. Joining me today is Rachel Lojko, Head of Sales, and Ben Charette, Datastream and ESG expert, both at Refinitiv. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So, Rachel, starting with you, what should a company's D&I strategy be, considering a couple of facts, considering that there is so much data out there that firms can access, and also considering the fact that consumers and investors have access to rankings that are really becoming more comparable across industries? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that the transparency and the exposure of the company should dictate their strategy. You know, I think transparency should be part of the company's strategy for how we start to affect outcomes and change. Understanding what the issues are comes with transparency into the data. So the more disclosure companies have, the more data that's collected and reported, the greater the ability the company has to address issues collectively with their competitors, peers, whatever it may be. And also we as employees, investors, whoever it may be, can obviously understand, you know, what's happening within these organizations. So I don't think your strategy changes. I think transparency should be core to every company's strategy when it comes to D&I. You know, there is a lot of data out there, which is great, and we're starting to see more. A lot on gender in particular, less so on ethnicity and race. So a lot of work could be done there in particular. We have things like how many women managers are at a company, but we don't have a lot of information on pay, for instance. So I think transparency is part of the strategy for companies, and the more they lean into that, I think the better. For all of us.
Yep, excellent point, particularly about the data that's there for gender, but still we're not where we need to be with race and ethnicity. And just talking a little bit more about transparency, we're talking about D&I transparency overall, but let's shift to the gender issue related to personal finance would be the closest relation there. Ben, taking a look at the data you've pulled from Datastream, are you able to talk about the differences in debt accrued from student loans from the perspective of men versus women?
Yeah, absolutely, Keesa. And once again, thanks so much for having me. So definitely when we took a look at the data, and by we, I mean the Datastream team, we noticed from the latest numbers here that women definitely possess most of the student debt. As many people are aware, the student debt crisis in the United States is something that is a hot topic. But really, when you look at the actual data itself, especially in that gender category, you do notice that is majority held by women, and definitely we'll take a look at that today. But definitely the data is telling us that as of the latest numbers that women unfortunately hold most of that debt. So that's the current status.
Okay. Yeah, I think just to add on to what Ben said, the debt crisis is something that's getting a lot of attention, and it's as we get to graduation, you know, and students are headed off to college, my stepdaughter included, you know, we're looking at what does the burden of the student debt crisis. It's interesting that it's growing, I think, 6 times faster in terms of student loans than the economy is growing. So it's an increasing issue. We started to look at the data largely driven by what was the impact of the pandemic on women in employment. We've done some blogs on that, which led us down this path to root causes. And some of what we were digging into was the student debt crisis. And when we started looking at the data, which actually is not an ESG data point, it's an economic data point from the Fed in particular, it really exposed an interesting statistic that women hold, you know, a majority of the outstanding federal loans, student loans.
And I echo that, Rachel. I mean, this is something that lots of us talk about in terms of, you know, the student loan debt. I know I talk to my girlfriends about it frequently, and I've had friends who said, hey, I'm not able to buy a house because my law school degree was my home in terms of the money that I paid. So clearly a huge issue that's being discussed all around. Now, we have the statistics there, and we know that the debt burden for women, 62% versus men at 38%. The expectation would be that women's earnings wouldn't would not represent, that discrepancy, but that the earnings would be a bit higher. That's not the case. Even though we have the 62-38, the earnings don't reflect that at all. Are there sectors or industries that are finding a solution as it relates to the earnings piece, finding a solution to pay parity? Do you see companies or even at the sector level who are really solving for that?
I mean, one thing I would notice or mention in there is that when we look at the industries, I mean, we'll take a look at it a little bit later in the presentation. There are definitely industries that are leading in terms of kind of their representation and kind of their involvement of females within the workplace. But I think when you look at a specific sector, I mean, financial services, we're proudly in that top category, but definitely. I don't think it's a sector problem per se, as much just a business problem. I don't know, Rachel, if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we kind of start off, Keesa, with the first kind of issue you raised, which is wages, right? When we started looking into the impact of the pandemic on employment of women, which was a hot topic in the media recently, the question is, why was the pandemic so impactful on women? And I think Ben has the next slide, we'll show it. We started to dig into why, right? And you start to look at some of the other topics related to gender. Most companies don't disclose salary, as I previously mentioned, but we do have some macro level data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics around men and women salaries, right? So it's not going to get sector specific, but we know at a high level, if you look at the chart here, and you can see kind of the absolute difference on that top slide in terms of men and women's wages, and then the percentages down at the bottom, men earn 18 to 20% more than women do in terms of disposable income, as represented by this chart. And we haven't really been closing that gap at all through the years, right? So as far as wages go, there's a meaningful issue. So if women are carrying a larger debt burden, perhaps part of it is correlated to this wage gap and the ability for women to pay off, or females to pay off, some of that student debt at pace with their male counterparts. And so you can see how these issues kind of knock on. And then I think to your second point, are there companies that are doing a better job than others in terms of pay, equal representation in the workforce, et cetera? And that's really what we can talk about more, is what are some of the solutions to these problems?
Yeah, I think just one thing to reiterate off that, Rachel, when the macro team took a look at this data, I think Rachel said it perfectly. The thing that was so alarming is that nothing's really coming closer, right? I mean, you look at that bottom chart we did analysis on, and really that gap sadly stayed consistent. And yet, when we look at some other charts down the road, you'll notice that there's constant participation of females in obtaining extremely impressive degrees. So I think that consistency, once again, is something that is interesting. And then, but as Rachel mentioned, noticing what the solutions are, that's kind of up for debate. But definitely would agree with you, Rachel, for sure.
Yeah,
great. And we see a lot of great data here. Thanks for pulling that. In the age of accountability, we do like to talk about where the responsibility lies. So does the data give us any sort of steer in terms of where the responsibility lies, in terms of HR, in terms of executive leadership?
Rachel, I don't know if you want to comment first on that, but
yeah. Why don't I take that first? I mean, look, there's lots of, we need to come at this in many different angles. I think part of the responsibility sits with the corporation to address why are women leaving the workforce at a faster rate than men. And I think, Ben, you've got a slide on the COVID impact in particular, and how that's had a dramatic impact on women in the workforce, in particular those who maintain families. So I think, the corporations and the employers have a real responsibility to take a look at the data and understand this because of, and I don't think we need to prove it, the benefits of equal representation in the workforce across all metrics of diversity, but gender is what we're talking about here. So companies, there's lots that they can do to address these issues, from HR policies around, daycare services, flex working hours, and our ESG database actually does report some of this information. So you can see, which companies do have daycare policies, flex working hours, et cetera, and how those companies perform and how they maintain more equal representation. But I would say, employers represent, I think, the most responsible to maintain women in the workforce and then continue to address pay gap issues.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would just add on to that, and once again, as Rachel mentioned, this chart kind of describes, Keesa, the unemployment rate of women who participate or maintain a family is the official statistic. And one thing that we definitely noticed within the Datastream team in partnership with ESG is that, so if you notice the drop of this unemployment rate from years specifically 2013 to 2019, I mean, it was a very significant drop. But one thing that was interesting is that we correlated that to the ESG database, and we have a slide that I'll pull up in a second. And that was a direct correlation to company activity and participation of policies and services for their employees, and kind of this drop in the unemployment rate. So obviously, if a company is insisting a daycare service included in their benefits, that's obviously going to make it more appealing for someone to go in who maintains a family. The one thing that was also interesting and something that we're going to monitor very closely is, as Rachel mentioned, that spike in COVID, right? So if you notice on the chart, obviously we had a massive unemployment rate spike regardless, but specifically in this category, it did spike to 16% because everyone was home. Now, the recovery from that is really the part that the macro team is specifically interested in, because right now we're noticing that the unemployment rate for maintained families for females is actually back at the numbers from 2013. We are curious to see if that will continue to drop and if we get back to numbers that were similar in 2017, 2018, and 2019. But I think that was something that we definitely spoke about and are curious about, is kind of what that recovery will look like. Is it going to go back to 2013 numbers, or hopefully we'll get back to those 2019 numbers? But I think in terms of the data, I do think that this chart is probably one of the most fascinating ones, because you see that COVID spike with many of our economic indicators, but then also this recovery, which is up for debate, frankly.
Wow.
And just to actually add on, because I want to make sure it's not just women who had a spike in unemployment during the pandemic. Men were also impacted, of course, but it was a much larger spike for women in terms of percentage. So don't want to leave men out of the impact of COVID, but just want to call out the excessive impact on women that we saw, and obviously looking for what that recovery will look like, which I think is a great point Ben made.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure we'll see a huge difference too if we're talking about women of color as well with that information. Question from the audience, and please feel free to continue to ask your questions. And this one is for, looks like Rachel. Many firms have discussed wanting to hit a benchmark of having a minimum amount of women in senior leadership roles. And looking at some of these firms who have made this commitment, is there any data about the gaps for women at these companies? If so, is it better or worse than average? So looking at those specific companies that have made those public declarations, Rachel.
Yeah, it's a good question. Interesting, and this is where transparency becomes so important. There are no standards when it comes to reporting ESG data. So there's no global standard. There are some frameworks out there for what companies should report. That is also sometimes industry specific, which is helpful. But when it comes to gender, what is collected in our database is largely the numbers of women in the workforce. So how many women employees are there? How many women in management are there? How many women board members are there? There's really no companies exposing the pay information. In the Russell 1000, for instance, it's not a field that we have reported. And that's why I think transparency is important, that you can see some of that information. There is, I believe, a law or movement in the UK for companies of a certain size to start to disclose this information, which I think will really help to create change. You know, there's lots of talks around targets and benchmarks, and are they good, bad, or otherwise. Our own company just put some out around race, for instance, race and ethnicity, which I think is really great to see, right? Because we can start to measure and hold people accountable for progress. I think we should see the same thing for pay, which we don't have today for across any metrics.
Right, and it looks like Ben has put up a very interesting chart here. Ben, do you want to talk us through this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think why I brought this up specifically when Rachel was talking is that Rachel's right. I mean, as of right now, all ESG data metrics are scheduled or filed on a voluntary basis. And so regarding kind of our conversation, right, definitely, and I alluded to this back in the previous slide, our team from the ESG side did analysis on kind of the Russell 1000 and those daycare services specifically. As Rachel mentioned, the ESG database from Refinitiv has over 450 different data metrics that frankly hit many different themes, not just what we're talking about today. But there are particular data metrics around gender and really, as Rachel alluded to, it's going to be more focused on percentage of females on the board, number of female employees, and really that pay necessarily is not something that is disclosed at this current time. But one thing that we definitely like to say on the ESG team is that all ESG themes kind of interlocked with one another. And so going back to that macro chart that we mentioned earlier, you'll notice here the trend, I mentioned the trend of how the unemployment for females who maintain families was dropping. And we did see a direct correlation between that drop and investment into specifically daycare services and other data metrics. So we did this analysis on the Russell 1000 as well as the S&P 500. So first we'll start with the Russell 1000 in kind of getting that holistic approach. But I think one thing that's important to note is that we always like to say that the largest companies are probably going to be your movers, right? Or the individuals that are going to be your leaders in terms of actions and where the world's going, or at least a good indicator for that. And one thing we've definitely noticed is this investment in family services, is what I would call them, as being starting to be a priority and really something that I think will assist in the solutions to kind of the problems that we mentioned earlier. Rachel, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but just wanted to kind of bring that up as you were mentioning the disclosure mark and kind of how we've taken some of those metrics to kind of get a gauge into kind of possible solutions, you might say.
No, I think you said it extremely well, Ben.
So from the data, from your experience, combining those things, what is the steer for encouraging women and girls, as well as all genders, to advocate for pay parity on a personal level? What mindset does society need to adopt? What sort of cultural changes do we need to look at having inside our corporations?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Ben, maybe you can jump in if you want to add anything. Look, I think, and I love this question. I do think while there's corporate responsibility, there's also personal responsibility. And it kind of goes back to our initial first chart, which we started talking about with the student debt crisis and women carrying more of that burden. You know, I think that there's a really interesting HBR article. I don't know if there's a way to communicate with the audience, but we can maybe send it out just around, and it's a pretty well-known stat. I think it was an HP study, you know, about women. You know, the first step is you need to go for these senior roles, right? You need to put your name in the hat to be promoted, to move into middle management, to get into senior management. And women feel they need to check the box on every credential before they even get into applying for the role. And part of that goes back to pursuit of degrees and advanced degrees, and how that's potentially viewed as a way to, more advanced degrees, a way to get ahead, right? So you can see how women are pursuing, you know, master's degrees at a higher rate, contributing and creating this vicious cycle around the debt crisis. So I think, we as females looking to progress our careers, close the pay gap in the workplace, need to make sure that, look, this isn't in any way a discouragement for going for advanced degrees. I personally went for it myself, but it's also making sure that it's not just about checking the box on credentials. It's about networking, creating sponsorship and mentorship. My personal experience with that has been very positive. And finding ways to advocate for yourself, not just check the box on the credentials to go for that next role, which comes with higher pay, which comes with all the benefits, et cetera, of moving up in an organization. So find a sponsor, create the network, go for stretch roles. Don't be afraid to swing for the fences. There's a lot we can achieve if we do that. And then, on a more tactical side, as you reach for those stretch roles, make sure that you're negotiating at that moment and taking advantage of those opportunities to improve and close that pay gap.
Excellent advice. Specifically, love how you differentiated the sponsorship there versus mentorship. Obviously, sponsorship, people who are advocating for you when you are not there, and then mentorshipping, the day-to-day kind of engagement goes deeper than that. So we can definitely take that to another discussion, but great distinction there. Another question from our audience: does your data speak to the financial support universities might provide to males versus females? Grants, for example, that would offer loan costs. Don't know if that's included in the data or not. Ben, do you have that information?
So, definitely happy to look into that further. My initial reaction is I don't have a particular data metric in mind for that, but actually it's a very interesting question and happy to look into it. Definitely when it comes into those specific efforts of universities as a whole, we would definitely take a look at the National Center for Education Statistics to see if that is collected. But off the top of my head, definitely we'll have to look into that. But it is one that could be extremely interesting to look at, because once again, see where these universities or institutions, frankly, I should say, are going. But Keesa, I definitely will have to take that back. Actually, that's a great question.
Well, and also while we're talking about that, let's talk about the types of metrics that you find in Datastream. You've shown some great charts here. Can you take us through what metrics that one can find in Datastream? What would be the use case? Who would be the user for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Datastream is Refinitiv's end-of-day time series database, and we're very well known for some particular asset classes, or as we call them, categories. But Datastream actually is over 500 million time series, believe it or not. So for that reason, it can be used in so many different manners. Definitely when you think of the most popular users, it's going to be that research use case, and essentially exactly what we are going through today. So whether that's an economist, a research analyst, an academic, we really see so many different users of Datastream. But I think the key to Datastream is definitely the vast amount of data within it. So when you ask that question of particular data metrics, it's kind of a loaded question for me almost, because the favorite part of my job is having the different categories and areas to speak to. But really, when you talk about the data that we have, for example, we have over 12 million economic indicators. So definitely can take that. And that's why we will definitely take that question and look into it further, because within our education category, I would imagine we can find some data that definitely alludes to that category. Whether it's the exact data metric, that I can't answer at this time. But definitely Datastream, Keesa, is used by so many different people because of its vast amount of data, but definitely more that historical analysis use case is what I'd say to that question.
So you can imagine why Ben didn't know the answer to the grants question out of 500 million time series. Ben couldn't tell us that one.
We're trying. I'll get there one day, but maybe not. But definitely.
Ben's a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah, so we can see definitely, with the load of data there, let's shift from the data to disclosure. And Rachel, for you, is D&I disclosure about managing risk or affecting outcomes?
I don't see any problem with it being both, to be honest with you. And maybe when I take managing risk, I think it's the business continuity and operational risk that we're talking about, not necessarily share price. It's how does a company maintain its competitive advantage and relevant in the marketplace as the world changes around it, right? And if you think about climate, for instance, separate to this conversation, but another whole category of content that we cover is data around climate change. In order for a company to stay to stay healthy, you need to look at the impact of climate risk on the operations of a company. And I think the same way about diversity and inclusion. The world is you just need to make sure that you're keeping your employees engaged, you're engaging your customers in the right way. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I think outcomes are absolutely what we're driving towards and most important, right? We need to make sure that the policies we're putting in place, what the data is telling us are those problems that were impacting outcomes. And that's why transparency is important, because you don't know if you're creating the right kind of change if you're not able to really measure it and understand it. So I don't see any issue with it being both, Keesa.
Fantastic insight, Rachel Lojko. I think I got it right that time. And
Lojko,
Ben
Lojko.
Okay, great. Lojko. I should have asked Lojko. And Ben Charette. Great. Who needs Google when we have Ben? Of course. Fantastic way to contextualize this, Ben. Thank you both so much for joining us. Great information.
Thanks, Keesa, for hosting us.
Thank you so much.
And if you, our audience, enjoyed today's episode, you can request more information on Refinitiv Datastream by following the link in the comments or scanning the QR code on your screen right now. I'm Keesa Shreen. Thank you so much for joining us, and be well.